Well, hey everybody, Mark Swanson here in this extremely experimental version of the lab sessions for SOE 302. I'm going to be cobbling together a video here. I want to thank Sophie, my doggo, for moral support, and my lovely girlfriend Jill for camera work and logistics. We took a trip here on this last Saturday, March 21st, down the Snake River Canyon, down the old spiral highway, down to Lewiston, Clarkston, and made a number of stops to take footage and take photos. And here I'm going to try to attempt to build it into one coherent whole that you all can watch from the comfort of your own homes. Our journey began, of course, in Pullman, Washington. We drove south on State Highway 195, and instead of going down the normal highway into the Lewiston-Clarkston area, we turned off on what's called the old spiral highway, which is a steep, curvy old country highway that goes in and out of canyons until it descends to the level of the Snake River. Then we turned along Old Wawawai Road, and we followed the Snake River westward, and we stopped at a number of places to take photos, take video, etc. So here's the satellite view of the route we took, and you can see that there are forest elements in the upper right. Of course, in the steeper, cooler canyons on north-facing slopes, you would have forest. And up on the plateau where Pullman is located, we have a lot of farm fields, which historically were Idaho fescue, blue bunch, wheatgrass, meadow steppe. So again, relatively mesic, moist, and cool, productive grasslands. Now, as you drop down into the canyon, and you can see here I've added some vegetation community designations here, you descend into a dry canyonland grassland, which has some very interesting floristic elements. And as we drove along the Snake River westward, the dominant community that we had on the dry, warm, south-facing slopes to our right consisted of the Pseudorignaria and Opuntia polyacantha prickly pear cactus habitat type. And so you can see in this photo right here, we have some desert parsley, Lomatium species, which is blooming right now. And we do have a high percent cover of the prickly pear cactus, Opuntia polyacantha, and also the Pseudorignaria spicata, our blue bunch wheatgrass. So a relatively xeric community relative to the moist grassland communities of the plateau about 2,000 feet above. So as we descended into this south-facing lower elevation system, of course, we expected to see a relatively more xeric community, and that's what we have. Most of the soils that we have along the way are iridosols, typically very skeletal, meaning that they're rocky. They have a high proportion of gravel and larger rock fragments, cobbles. But areas that have a little bit deeper soil deposition tend to be mollisolic in nature. So they're those deep productive mollisols that have a very fine texture. They tend to consist of wind deposited material, but they are also relatively xeric mollisols. And how do we know they're xeric? Well, again, look for that calcareous layer below the active soil layer. And you can see in this cross-sectional photo right here that there's a pretty calcareous layer as shown by the white portion of the soil profile. And above it, we have a grayish, slightly more organic active layer of the soil. And again, a very good indication that you're in a xeric environment when you have that calcareous deposition deep in the soil profile. Well, all right, here we are in the lovely Snake River Canyon. I'm Dr. Mark Swanson, and welcome to another exciting episode of examining our arid land ecosystems here in eastern Washington. Well, we have a number of the plants that we've seen in laboratory sessions already. Right here we've got Pseudorignaria spicata, which is our blue bunch wheatgrass. And as you can see, it's a very heavily tufted perennial grass, and with those characteristic inflorescences sticking up above the basal rosette of leaves. Again, a very dominant strategy for dealing with aridity is to be a perennial bunch grass and get everything done here in this late spring, early summer season, and then go dormant for the rest of the year. Another plant that has this strategy is our Lomatium dissectum. It's one of the desert parsleys in the carrot family. And again, it's taking advantage of the brief spring to early summer period where it has both moderate temperatures as well as abundant soil moisture to flower, set seed, before it goes dormant for the duration of the summer. And if we were to dig down, we would find a very deep carrot-like root that is going to hold a lot of the resources that are created during this brief spring to early summer period, and it stores it below ground for the following year's growing season. Down here in the valley bottom, we have a number of old river gravels, which were deposited by the action of the Snake River over the millennia. And these gravels are a substrate for many of the grasses that we've studied in our laboratory sessions. A very good example of this is the purple threon, Aristida purpurea, which is a grass that specializes not just in arid environments, but in a sandy or gravelly substrate. And this is one of the most recognizable grasses because the lemma has 3 very prominent awns that come out of the terminus of that lemma there. So one of the most recognizable of our dryland grasses. Another grass that is characteristic of very gravelly substrates is this one right here. This is the sand dropseed, Sporobolus cryptandra, which is very recognizable for the very tiny little florets in a beautifully complex panicle, and also with very hairy collars to the leaf. A lot of these grasses, of course, are dormant right now. We're still fairly early in the spring here in eastern Washington, but we'll see a whole new generation of leaves being produced, and round about June we'll see the inflorescences, or the flowering stems, being produced before it sets seed. Now, bunch grasses and these perennial herbs aren't the only growth forms, of course, that we have. One of the major elements of the shrub step is, in fact, shrubs. And this is green rabbit brush right here, Chrysothamnus viscidiflorus, and it is a very drought-tolerant and heat-tolerant member of the shrub step community. And it's just barely beginning to put out its leaves for the late spring, early summer season. This rather impressive shrub is Prunus virginiana, which is chokecherry. It's a member of the cherry genus, which you all probably know from the grocery store and from the orchard. But you can tell it's a cherry here even before the leaves have come out from the horizontal lenticels on the stems, which are little horizontal lines that kind of girdle the stem. It's one of the most recognizable attributes of the cherry genus. Now, chokecherry is very common in the canyonlands of the interior west, and it's a very important source of fruit for birds and mammals and for human beings as well during the historic period. So it produces these long inflorescences that ultimately produce white flowers and then very black cherry-like drupes, which is where you have that one single stony seed within the flesh. It's rather acrid and bitter tasting, but it can be sweetened a little bit by long storage. And again, a very important source of food for a number of species of wildlife. This is a typical spring day here in the interior Columbia Basin, and some of the earliest flowering plants are doing their thing. Here we've got Lomatium dissectum, that cut-leaf desert parsley that I told you about earlier. And here we have prickly pear cactus, which is common across the Great Plains and across the Columbia Basin and the Great Basin as well to the south of us, and it makes its way all the way up into southern British Columbia, and it's got very flattened stems. That's how you can tell it from some of the other prickly pear species that are out there. So this is also an indication that our region is bioclimatically affiliated with the Great Basin and areas to our south that have really hot, dry summers. The fact that a cactus is an adaptable growth form here is indicative of the drought stress and the heat of the environment here. The grass that you see here is predominantly bunch grasses in the blue bunch wheatgrass species, so Pseudoignaria spicata, and as you can see, it dots the hillside here. Co-dominant with the prickly pear cactus, and of course at this time of year with the desert parsley, the Lomatium. Up on the hillside above us, you can see that the chokecherry, which is the dominant shrub here, occurs largely on the edge of those talus elements. So this is called a shrub garland phenomenon, where the shrubs are really going to be most competitive in the deep broken soils of the edge of the talus. So they can access moisture and nutrients from the adjacent fine textured soils, but be out of the way of competition of the grasses and lower shrubs. And so the tall shrubs really are going to be found on the margin of those talus elements So again, substrate really is a dominant control on the distribution of the different growth forms here in the interior Columbia Basin. This low shrub with thickened stems and a broad crown is hackberry, Celtis douglasii. It's pretty common to the east of us, but it really comes west only into the Snake River Canyon. And again, it's a very drought-adapted, tough shrub with relatively thickened, hard leaves, which is part of its adaptation to aridity. It's a really useful tool for perceiving the effect of grazing on the landscape. For example, on this side of the fence, you can see that the green rabbit brush is the most visible element of the flora, and most of the grasses are gone, especially the bunch grasses, and this situation is going to be largely dominated by those Eurasian annual grasses such as cheatgrass. On this side of the fence, on the other hand, grazing pressure is apparently much diminished because there's still good representation of the bunch grasses, especially the blue bunch wheatgrass, our pseudorhynchia. We still have the shrubs, of course, including the hackberry and the green rabbit brush, but you can see we have abundant coverage, about 30 to 50% of those native perennial bunch grasses. Alright, here we are cruising east along the Snake River back towards Lewiston, Clarkston. Got my co-pilot and camera woman Jill. Got Sophie in the back seat. She wants to go for a hike, but we can't right now. We gotta take video. And here you can see the characteristic stepped profile of the Columbia River flood basalts. They're several kilometers thickness. They got poured out about 15 to 18 million years ago from vents in what is now Northeast Oregon and poured out across the interior Columbia Basin. And of course the Snake River kept down cutting through those basalt layers as they accumulated. And so that's the valley feature that we're driving along now. And of course, a lot of soil got blown in and deposited on top of these Columbia River flood basalts. But of course, here on these steep canyon sides, we have very thin soils, which contributes to the effective aridity. Another thing that contributes to effective aridity is the aspect. Of course, on these warm south-facing slopes here, we have more blue bunch wheatgrass and Sandberg's bluegrass. But if you shift over to those cooler north-facing slopes on the other side of the river, you'd have more Idaho fescue as a component of the grasses. So again, the geology and the topography really control a lot of what you see in terms of the vegetation. As we drove back up the main highway out of Lewiston towards Pullman and Moscow, we encountered several bands of mule deer grazing on the lush spring foliage as the bunch grasses begin to leaf out and a number of the forbs begin to put out their foliage. The mule deer are taking good advantage of that. What you see here is a group of does that are working their way across a ridge. As the foliage dries out on these south-facing slopes, they'll shift back to the farm fields and to shrubs as